Get out, old lady! My DIL screamed. The next day I sold the house she lived in. Margaret had always been the quiet heart of the family, a woman whose life seemed woven into the very fabric of the home she shared, with her son Josh, his wife Brittany, and their lively 5-year-old daughter, Annie. At 67, her hair was the soft silver of dawn clouds, and her gentle smile carried a warmth that had soothed years of family storms. She had never made a fuss, never demanded the center stage. Instead, she was the steady presence in the background, the one who remembered birthdays, packed school lunches, and spent weekends baking the blend of cinnamon and vanilla that Annie adored. But beneath the calm surface, Margaret cradled a quiet hope for what she believed she deserved now, in this twilight chapter of her life. A little peace, a little respect, a bit of dignity. That hope began to unravel one bright Tuesday morning in the modest, sunlit kitchen of their suburban home. The smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon mingled with the soft hum of birds outside the window. Margaret was setting the table, humming a tune she hadn't thought about for years, when Brittany's sharp voice shattered the peaceful rhythm. "You're in my way again, Margaret. Seriously, get out of the kitchen." Brittany snapped without looking up from scrolling on her phone. The word again stung, a reminder of the growing distance between them. Margaret backed away as if a sudden chill had swept through the room, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced at Josh, who was shoveling oatmeal into his mouth, eyes flickering nervously between the two women. Margaret's voice wavered. "I just wanted to help with breakfast." Brittany cut her off with a sudden, seething scream that rang like a whip crack through the small room. "Get out, old lady!" Her words echoed, sharp and cruel, lingering longer than necessary. Annie looked up wide-eyed, clutching her spoon frozen midair. Josh's face paled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Margaret's heart pounded so loud she thought it might burst. The world shifted beneath her, the kitchen shrinking, the walls closing in. She felt the burn of tears stinging her cheeks, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she swallowed hard and turned away, the wooden floor cold beneath her trembling feet. Outside the kitchen window, the maple leaves danced in a gentle breeze, mocking her sudden loss of footing in the very place she called home. Margaret's eyes caught the delicate petals of a daffodil in the garden, fresh and resilient, despite frost. A bitter irony. She moved to the small back porch, leaning on the railing, her chin pressed to her chest. The warmth of the morning sun did nothing to thaw the sting of humiliation. Every breath was sharp, like inhaling cold glass. "I'm not invisible," she whispered to herself, though her voice was cracked with disbelief. Behind her, faint sounds of Brittany laughing sharply at something on her phone carried through the open window. Josh's chair scraped softly against the tiled floor, as if even he wanted to escape. Margaret's thoughts spun in a whirlwind of memories. Holding Annie as a baby, the quiet nights spent comforting Josh after tough days, all the years she sacrificed for this family. Yet here she was, reduced to a frail shadow in her own home. A sudden sharpness settled in her chest, not just from pain, but from the tiny ember of something new, a resolve to find her place again. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater and looked ahead, plodding silently, like the calm before a storm. The day was just beginning, but for Margaret, a long battle was already unfolding inside, a fight not for pride or revenge, but for respect and the home she loved. And as she stepped back into the kitchen, the air still heavy with Brittany's last brutal words, Margaret's quiet world was forever changed. The words echoed in Margaret's ears long after Brittany stormed out of the kitchen, leaving a room thick with tension and shattered calm. "Get out, old lady." It wasn't just a sentence. It was an accusation, a declaration of dismissal that sliced right through Margaret's heart. She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands curled tightly around a chipped coffee mug, the heat barely warming her numb fingers. Across the table, Josh stared at his breakfast, unwilling or unable to meet her eyes. Brittany was already upstairs, her footsteps muffled, but the sting of her words vivid. Margaret had sensed the change brewing for months. Brittany's disdain had once been subtle, an eye roll here, a sigh there. But now, every interaction was laced with contempt. The house, once a sanctuary where Margaret's presence was acknowledged, was becoming a place where she felt like a guest in a home she'd helped build. This morning was a grim reminder. Brittany was effectively the household manager now, making decisions with clipped authority and no room for debate. The chaotic energy that every new chapter in a family brings was mostly on Brittany's terms, and Margaret's suggestions had become unwelcome interruptions. "Mom, you can't just wander up and down the hallway whenever you want," Brittany had snapped yesterday, voice sharp as glass shards. "We've got a routine here." Josh had shrugged uneasily, caught in the middle, his usual warmth toward his mother dimmed by the awkwardness Brittany commanded. Now, as the sunlight pushed through lace curtains, dust motes floating like tiny spirits in the air, Margaret felt invisible. Her gaze drifted to Annie, sitting quietly with her toast, clutching a well-worn teddy bear, eyes darting between her mother and grandmother. Annie's silence was heartbreaking, too young to understand the fracturing tension, old enough to sense it. Margaret's heartbeat was a thunder in her ears, and tears gathered unbidden, not out of anger, but a profound sadness, a sense that the foundation beneath her was cracking. The kitchen, with its worn wooden cabinets and faded linoleum floor, had been her stage for so many small joys: baking cookies with Annie, sharing a cup of tea with Josh talking about his day, quiet moments with her late husband's portrait hanging over the sink. Now it was a battlefield of dismissal. She blinked quickly, forcing the tears back, refusing to give Brittany that satisfaction. The comforting aroma of brewed coffee was now mingled with the bitter taste of humiliation. Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper as she said, "Josh, shouldn't you say something?" Josh's eyes flickered with guilt, but his lips pressed into a line. "Mom, it's complicated." "Complicated," Margaret echoed bitterly. "So I'm just complicated now?" Brittany's footsteps paused just outside the kitchen door, and then the sharp rattle of a chair scraping jolted Margaret's attention. Brittany's voice carried through the thin walls, laced with mockery. "She should just pack up and leave. Honestly, this house isn't big enough for 3 generations." The sting of the words stabbed deeper than the chill in the air. Margaret's fingers tightened on the mug as the scar of rejection settled around her. She longed to speak, to defend herself, but what could she say? How do you argue when you're told you don't belong? The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, as Brittany's disdain clung like cobwebs in the corners. A tear slipped free, and Margaret quickly wiped it away. Outside through the kitchen window, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the sprawling yard where Annie had played so freely just days ago. Maybe I don't belong here anymore, Margaret thought, swallowing the lump in her throat. Yet beneath the ache, a glimmer of resilience flickered. This was her home. This was her family. And no scream, no bitterness could erase the years she had poured into both. She took a slow, steadying breath. Tomorrow would come, with its own challenges, but Margaret knew she had to find a way to reclaim her place, not just in the house, but in the lives she loved. As the coffee cooled against her palms, she dared to wonder, how much longer would she let this dismissal define her existence? And was it time to stand in her own light once more? The evening air wrapped around the house like a cold, unwelcome blanket as Margaret settled into the worn armchair in the corner of Brittany's once cozy sitting room. A different room now, filled with stale tension and unspoken resentments. The fading light cast long shadows across the walls, and the familiar hum of quiet suburban life drifted in from outside, contrasting starkly with the turmoil knotting her stomach. She had hoped to smooth out the jagged edges from the morning's explosive breakfast. Margaret told herself it was worth trying. After all, family was about patience, about finding fragile common ground. But when Brittany returned from work, the cold, icy air between them was unmistakable. Mom, Margaret began gently, her voice tentative, like a thread stretched thin. Maybe we can talk about what happened today. Brittany barely spared her a glance, her fingers tapping rhythmically against her phone's glass screen. There's nothing to talk about, she said flatly, her tone carrying the weight of finality. You gotta realize this isn't your house anymore. Margaret's heart twisted sharply. Josh and I, this is our family home. Don't you think we should try to get along? Brittany's smirk was cold, dismissive. Get along? She laughed under her breath. You don't get it, do you? We've moved on. You're just in the way. The words stung like shards of ice, but Margaret mustered a gentle nod, careful not to let her trembling hands betray her. Later that night, the house fell into uneasy silence. Margaret moved toward the kitchen for a glass of water, overhearing Brittany's muffled voice on the other side of the wall, the one that sliced through her heart. I'm telling you, she's dead weight. Dragging us all down, Brittany said into her phone, voice low but sharp. Can you imagine, still bossing us around after all this time? Margaret's breath hitched. The cruel verdict echoed with merciless clarity. She pressed her palm flat against the cool kitchen countertop, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Somewhere nearby, a chess set sat abandoned on the coffee table, the pieces frozen mid-game, a quiet symbol of battles lost and won in silence. The next day, as Margaret went to retrieve a treasured porcelain vase she had kept safely on a high shelf, she caught sight of a cardboard box tucked into the dim corner of the garage. Curiosity prickled alongside dread, and she edged closer. Inside were family heirlooms, her grandmother's delicate teaspoons, the hand-stitched quilt that had been passed down through generations, framed photographs faded by sun and time. They were packed away carelessly, as no forgotten memories tossed aside. A sharp pang of loss stabbed her chest. She traced a finger over the edge of a silver spoon, its warmth long faded by cold neglect. Suddenly, a small voice broke through the silence. Grandma! Margaret turned to see little Annie peeking shyly around the doorway, clutching a crayon-drawn picture. The drawing had rough pink and green lines outlining a house with a smiling sun floating in the corner and a tiny stick figure labeled Grandma. Margaret's lips curved in a soft, surprised smile as she rose and knelt before her granddaughter, her heart swelling with unexpected warmth. Thank you, sweetheart, she whispered, taking the colorful paper tenderly. This means more than you know. But beneath the flicker of hope, the suffocating tension at home refused to ease. The day's shadows lengthened, and Margaret's mind raced, trying to hold on to that small, fragile light, while shadows loomed larger. As darkness settled outside the window, she wondered how much more she could endure, and whether the house that once felt like a refuge could still hold her safe. Would this quiet resilience be enough to weather the storms ahead? The morning sun spilled weakly through the sheer curtains, casting pale light over the muted walls of the house at once felt like Margaret's sanctuary. But today, it felt like a cage. The peaceful hum of sparrows outside was a cruel contrast to the weight pressing down inside. Margaret returned from her morning walk, the crisp autumn air having cleared her head, if only briefly. She expected the familiar comfort of home, but instead found a door closed firmly against her, her bedroom door. Not slightly closed, but locked. A simple twist of the knob yielded nothing. Her heart sank, fingers trembling as she tested the lock again. A faint scrape came from down the hallway, a shuffle of footsteps. Her son Josh, standing just beyond the doorway. He looked away quickly, avoiding her gaze. His usual warmth was replaced by a suffocating silence that felt heavier than any shouted words. "Josh!" Margaret's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Why? Why am I locked out of my own room?" He swallowed nervously, glancing towards the hallway as if searching for an escape route. "Mom, Brittany said it's better this way. She wants things to be clear." "Clear?" Her voice rose, tinged with incredulity and disbelief. "This is my home, my room." From further inside the house, Faint sounds of Brittany's laughter echoed, bright, sharp, and utterly unaware of the storm she'd brewed. Margaret felt the stab of isolation sharpen into something fierce and raw. The guest room, her temporary quarters, was nothing like her own room. The walls were bare, the bed small and stiff, the window overlooking the neighbor's cramped fence. She placed her trembling hands on the cold, plastic headboard, her mind reeling from the injustice. How had it come to this? How had a woman she'd welcomed, tended to, and tried to support become the architect of her downfall? Margaret's eyes drifted to a small family photograph resting atop the dusty mantelpiece in the living room. A picture of her late husband, herself, Josh as a boy, and Brittany, smiling for the camera some years ago, filled with promise. Nothing in that photo reflected this current fracture. Her hands shook as she reached for the frame, heart-drenched in profound loss and confusion. With a shudder, she whispered to the empty room, "Is this really my legacy? To be shut out and forgotten in the house my husband built and loved?" Her breath hitched, chest tightening with a desperate ache. She considered the long years of quiet endurance, of sacrifices made quietly and without complaint. And now, faced with this cruel exclusion, the weight of invisibility threatened to bury her. Deep beneath the churning storm of hurt, a spark flickered, a fragile flame fueled by years of wisdom and silent strength. There was more to her than this moment of despair. She pressed her palms into the cool wood of the mantel, steadying herself. If this was rock bottom, then it was also the ground where she might find new roots. The house was no longer the haven she remembered, but it was still hers in ways Brittany and Josh might not yet understand. Margaret breathed deeply and met the silent challenge of the empty room. A quiet resolve settled over her, as potent and certain as dawn's first light, piercing a long night. Could she rise from this shadow? Could she reclaim not only her space, but her dignity? In the reflection of the glass, Margaret saw a woman not defeated, but quietly ready to fight for the home and respect she deserved. As she stood there, the house held its breath, and so did she. Isn't it remarkable how even in the darkest moments, hope can find a way to flicker? Margaret sat quietly on the narrow twin bed in the guest room, the thin mattress creaking beneath her slight weight. The soft rustle of leaves outside filtered through the half-open window, carrying the faint scent of early spring blooms and freshly mown grass, a sharp contrast to the turmoil roiling inside her. The once familiar house now felt like a stranger's domain, its walls holding whispered secrets Margaret was only beginning to understand. In the dim light of the evening, she opened the top drawer of the small bedside table and carefully lifted out an aged, worn envelope. The paper crackled softly in her hands. Inside was the original deed to the family home, yellowed with time, but immaculate in its significance. Her late husband's steady handwriting graced the top, "Our home, forever yours." She traced the words gently, feeling their weight settle in her chest like a quiet anchor. This was her proof, her strength, hidden in plain sight, a legacy not dependent on approval, but on truth. For years, the house had been her family's heart, her husband's dream, and most of all, her own sanctuary. But Brittany's callous assertion that Margaret no longer belonged here had awakened something dormant. Margaret glanced up as a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Mara, an old friend from church and now a trusted real estate agent. Someone Margaret had confided in years ago but hadn't spoken to since. Maya's gray eyes were kind but sharp, the kind that never missed a thing. "Thought I'd stop by to see how you're holding up," Mara said, stepping inside, her voice low but steady. "Heard things have been rough." Margaret gave a small, appreciative smile. "You have no idea. It's like they're trying to erase me, like I'm just a ghost here." Mara nodded, settling into the chair opposite the bed. "You're not. And you certainly don't have to stay silent. You know legally you have rights here. Did you know you're still the sole owner of this place?" Margaret's breath caught. "I didn't. I thought since Josh and Brittany live here now, maybe things had changed." "There's a lot people don't realize," Mara said, pulling out a tablet and showing Margaret official documents. Ownership doesn't disappear just because someone else moves in or feels entitled. We can help you make sure things are done right. The heaviness in Margaret's chest began to lift, replaced by a flicker of determination. This was more than just a place to live. It was her home, her history, and it wasn't going anywhere. Mara leaned in, voice a gentle whisper. If you want, I can help you look into options. There's power in knowing the truth, and even more in standing for yourself. Margaret's eyes grew moist, but this time with guarded hope. The corner of her mouth lifted in a hint of a smile. Thank you, Mara. I think it's time I stopped fading into the background. After Mara left, Margaret sat back, feeling a ripple of calm that she hadn't experienced in weeks. She pulled her late husband's note from the envelope. Words he had written in a letter years ago. They glowed softly in her memory. You are stronger than you know, and this home is yours to cherish. The night deepened, filled with quiet resolve. For the first time, Margaret felt her future calling softly, not as a victim, but as a woman ready to reclaim her dignity and place. Somewhere beyond the shadows of hurt, a new path was beginning to take shape. Could she transform this sense of quiet strength into action? Could she rewrite what home meant? Not just for herself, but for everyone who had forgotten what family truly required. The first step was simple: knowledge. The second, courage. And Margaret had begun to find both, one measured breath at a time. By midday, Margaret sat across from a young couple whose faces radiated warmth and promise, their smiles a balm to her bruised spirit. The sunlight streamed through the bay window, casting golden highlights over the polished wood floor and shimmering softly on the brass doorknobs her late husband had once lovingly chosen. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh paint and a faint undertone of old memories. The house now quietly holding its breath for the change about to come. Signing the final papers, Margaret's hand felt steady, her heart pulsing with a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. This was not just a transaction, it was a reclaiming, a declaration that the years of silent endurance and painful dismissal were no longer to be ignored or minimized. The house that had been her home for decades was officially passing into new hands, ending a chapter filled with both love and heartbreak. Later that afternoon, the living room filled with the muted murmur of footsteps and shifting energy as family gathered. Margaret stood tall by the fireplace, the familiar mantle behind her, adorned with the very family photo that had once seemed so fragile in the shadow of Brittany's cruelty. Brittany lounged on the couch with an expectant, skeptical smirk, while Josh's hands trembled slightly, his face pale and uncertain. Margaret's voice was calm but resolute, the echo in the room carrying the weight of unspoken battles finally spoken aloud. I have something important to tell you, she began softly, eyes locking first with Josh's, then slowly sweeping over Brittany. The house, it's been sold. I signed the papers today. A sharp intake of breath sliced through the quiet. Brittany's smirk faded, her eyes widening, color draining from her face like a winter sky losing its light. Sold? She echoed, disbelief coloring her tone. You don't have that right. This isn't just your decision. Margaret met her gaze without flinching. It is my decision. I'm still the sole owner of this home, and I've chosen to sell it. Josh's mouth opened, searching for words, but none came. Brittany stood abruptly, the room thick with stunned silence and shifting power. The dynamic that had held Margaret down was now fragile, but unmistakably reversed. The house must be vacated by the end of the month, Margaret continued, her voice steady. All of us, including you, Brittany. The finality in her words settled over the room like a quiet snowfall, cold but cleansing. Brittany's fists clenched at her sides while Josh swallowed hard, the reality sinking in like cold water. For the first time in weeks, Margaret's shoulders lifted as if the weight that had bowed her down was finally lifting. This was not a surrender or a bitter act of revenge. It was a reclamation of dignity, a necessary step toward healing and fairness. Her gaze softened when she saw her granddaughter creeping close by the doorway, innocent and trusting, a reminder of the future yet to be shaped. Margaret took a deep breath, a small, quiet smile curving the corners of her lips. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't about winning or losing the house, but about standing up for who you are. The household, once ruled by simmering tension and unspoken contempt, now shifted into a new rhythm, one where respect, accountability, and truth began to take root. As the afternoon light faded, Margaret's mind didn't race with fear, but blossomed with possibilities. A future crafted not by fear or exclusion, but by courage and clarity. And she knew deep down that this moment was both an ending and a powerful beginning. Isn't it remarkable how one woman's quiet strength can change the course of an entire family's story? The living room hung heavy with a silence so thick it felt impossible to breathe. Margaret stood near the fireplace, her eyes steady on Brittany, whose face was ashen, lips pressed into a thin line of disbelief and anger. Josh hovered awkwardly at the side, his usual confident posture replaced with a weighed-down shyness, eyes downcast, yet searching. The granddaughter watched from the hallway, clutching her drawing, the fragile thread that still connected the broken family. Margaret took a slow, deliberate breath, the weight of years folding into this moment like a slow dawn breaking over the horizon. She no longer felt small or invisible. This was her time. "I have lived in this house for more than 40 years," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "I raised Josh here. I shared this home with his father, the man who built it with love and sweat, and I never asked for much in return, except kindness and respect." Brittany's jaw tightened, but Margaret met her gaze evenly, empathy flickering beneath the steel. "For a long time, I let silence speak, hoping things would be easier if I didn't rock the boat. But silence isn't peace when it steals your dignity," she continued, eyes glimmering with the depth of unshed tears. "I endured disrespect, scorn, and now exclusion, all in this house that is supposed to hold family." Josh finally spoke, his voice rough, hesitant. "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I was scared to confront Brittany because I didn't want to rock our family or lose what we have." Margaret smiled gently, a sadness mingling with understanding. "Josh, love isn't about what's easy. It's about standing up for those you care about, even when it's hard. It's never too late to make things right." Turning back to Brittany, Margaret's tone softened but held firm. "You took this house for granted. You belittled me in front of this family, and today? That has consequences. But this isn't about punishment. It's about learning respect and recognizing the worth of every person in this home." Brittany swallowed hard, her defiance waning in the face of Margaret's quiet strength. Her eyes flickered with something unspoken, regret, perhaps, or the dawning realization of her actions. Margaret opened her arms, inviting rather than confronting. "We're family. Families aren't perfect. They stumble, they fall, but they also forgive and rebuild. I'm willing to start that journey, but it must be with honesty and respect." A hush settled over the room. Margaret's granddaughter stepped forward tentatively, wrapping her small arms around Margaret's leg. Margaret knelt to embrace her, drawing strength from that small presence of innocence and love. Josh, visibly moved, stepped closer. "Mom, thank you for showing me the kind of strength that really matters." Margaret's heart swelled. The humiliation, the pain, the long nights of feeling unseen, all had led to this moment of reclaiming her voice and her place. As the family began to breathe again, tentative but real, Margaret stood tall, not just as a mother or grandmother, but as a woman who had endured injustice and found her light through it. Her steady composure wasn't just a shield, it was a beacon, one that promised healing was possible when courage met compassion. In the quiet aftermath, blessings whispered between the cracks of brokenness. Change was unfolding, slow but certain. Because sometimes, the most powerful battles are fought not with anger, but with the unwavering grace of someone who knows their worth. And Margaret had found hers. Isn't it amazing? how standing up for yourself can illuminate a path to healing for everyone. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Margaret's new condo, casting warm patterns on the hardwood floors and filling the room with a gentle glow. The walls, freshly painted a soft cream, echoed with a quiet peace she hadn't felt in months. The faintest scent of lavender from the sashes on the dresser mingled with the clean linen sheets on her bed. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret allowed herself to breathe fully, her shoulders loosening under the light. This small, sunlit space was hers, truly hers. From the living room, she could hear the playful giggles of neighbors, chatting warmly as they watered their plants in the shared garden outside. A gentle reminder that community was still possible, even after upheaval. A soft knock at the door stirred her from her thoughts. It was her granddaughter, Annie, clutching a small bundle of wildflowers picked from the garden path, her bright eyes shining with affection and innocence. "Grandma, look!" Annie exclaimed, holding out the flowers. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling as she bent down to embrace the child. "Thank you, sweetheart. These are beautiful." The simplicity of the moment, a tender hug, the vibrant petals, the child's unfiltered love, felt like a balm to all the wounds of the past months. Later that afternoon, a knock echoed again, softer this time. On the doorstep stood Josh, carrying a basket of fresh fruit and a hesitant smile. He looked older somehow, quieter, his eyes reflecting a new respect and remorse that hadn't been there before. "Mom," he greeted softly, stepping inside with care and warmth. "I wanted to see how you're doing." Margaret welcomed him into the cozy living room, the sun casting golden hues on his thoughtful face. Words weren't needed immediately. There was healing in the shared quiet, in the acknowledgement without excuses. Over cups of tea, they spoke gently about the past, and Josh's apologies were sincere, layered with the weight of realization and regret. Margaret listened, a soft kindness in her eyes. "It's never too late, Josh," she said. "What matters is how we move forward." Days passed, and with each, Margaret's new life gently unfurled, a routine filled with small joys and steady connections. The neighbors became friends, the garden a place of solace. She volunteered at the local library and took to morning walks along the sunlit trails, the crisp air filling her lungs with promise. In the quiet, she reflected on the painful lessons carved from her ordeal. The sting of disrespect and dismissal could have broken her, yet it became the forge that tempered her strength. She realized something profound. True worth isn't measured by others' recognition, but by the kindness and dignity one holds steadfastly within. Margaret's story wasn't just about loss or conflict. It was a testament to perseverance, compassion, and the quiet power of reclaiming one's life. The woman once pushed to the margins had found a new center, a place where respect wasn't demanded but lived. As the sun dipped low one evening, Margaret stood on her balcony, the city skyline glowing in the distance like scattered stars. The wind whispered gently, carrying with it the memory of the house she'd sold, a chapter closed with grace and the promise of new beginnings. She smiled softly, a heart unburdened and free. Have you ever underestimated the quiet strength in someone simply because they didn't make noise? Remember, dignity and kindness are forces that rebuild lives and mend hearts. Is this story resonated with you? Please hit that subscribe button. See you in our next story.